It was the winter of 1891, a season the old-timers in the Black Elk Mountains would never forget. For 3 straight weeks, snow had fallen in waves so thick, the air itself seemed to turn to glass. The wind scoured the ridges without mercy, carving the drifts into cruel shapes that swallowed fences and choked out the trails. Jonas Hale, a solitary trapper with a weathered face and hands hardened by years in the wild, had been fighting his way home from the high pass. The marten traps he'd set days before were buried now, and his sled was nearly empty. Only a few pelts strapped under the canvas. Hunger pressed on him like the cold did, steady and relentless. By late afternoon, the light had gone thin and gray. The forest stood silent under the snow's heavy weight. Jonas's boots sank deep with every step, his breath hanging in long plumes. He was already thinking about the fire he'd build back at his cabin when something cut across the wind. Faint, sharp, wrong. He stopped dead. At first he thought it was the cry of some night bird, but it came again, broken and human. Jonas turned toward the sound, his heart climbing into his throat. The slope ahead was treacherous, a scatter of jagged rocks, hidden under the snow. He moved slow, rifle slung across his back, scanning for the source. Then he saw her, a young woman, barefoot, stumbling between 2 fir trees as if she'd been walking for days. Her dress was torn, the hem frozen stiff, bare legs mottled blue with cold. Her hair clung to her face in wet tangles, and she swayed with each step. Jonas was beside her in an instant. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough but steady. Her eyes met his, wide, glazed, and so full of fear he could almost feel it radiate from her. "They said they'd come back for me," she whispered, though her lips barely moved. Jonas didn't ask who they were. Not yet. He pulled off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The wool hung almost to her ankles, swallowing her small frame. "We're getting you out of here," he told her. When he tried to guide her forward, she faltered. Her knees buckled. Without thinking, Jonas scooped her into his arms. She was light, far too light, and the cold in her skin cut through even his calloused hands. The blizzard swallowed them as he trudged on, each step a battle. But far ahead, in the endless white, Jonas thought he saw it, a faint flickering glow, lights, and he knew that if he could keep moving, if he could hold her just a little longer, those lights might mean the difference between a grave in the snow and the start of something neither of them had dared to hope for. The wagon wheels groaned as they rolled over the uneven dirt road, each jolt rattling through her fragile bones. It wasn't the kind of journey where the destination mattered, at least not to her. The men who'd taken her weren't speaking, but she could feel their mood, the way cruelty clung to them like a bad smell. Her arms were bound with a length of coarse rope, looped tight enough to burn the skin at her wrists. Every time the wagon hit a rut, the rope bit deeper, the fibers grinding against raw flesh. She tried to shift, but one of them snapped. "Sit still." Without even looking at her, the landscape stretched wide and empty on either side, the kind of open plains that made you feel small. The late afternoon sun hung low, turning the horizon to fire, but there was no beauty in it for her. Not with the taste of blood still coppery in her mouth, not with her arms aching from where they'd been twisted too far. She was just cargo now. They stopped at dusk, not because they were tired, but because they wanted to. One man hopped down from the wagon, walked to a nearby mesquite tree, and took his time rolling a cigarette. The other stayed seated, leaning back with his boots up, looking at her like she was a problem he hadn't decided how to solve yet. She thought about running, but her legs wouldn't carry her far, and both men had revolvers on their hips. Besides, she'd learned enough about men like this. They enjoyed the chase more than the catch. When they did speak, it was in half-muttered phrases that didn't mean much to her, though she caught pieces. "Teach her," "quiet down," "ain't our problem." The wagon started again. Hours bled into more hours. Night came cold and sudden, the wind sharp enough to make her teeth chatter. The road grew rougher. Somewhere out there in the dark, a coyote howled. Then, without warning, they pulled her down from the wagon. One of them held her steady, while the other rummaged through a saddlebag. She braced for a blow, but instead they shoved a crust of bread into her mouth, almost like feeding a dog. She didn't thank them. Couldn't, really. And they didn't expect it. They tied her to the back of the wagon now, making her walk behind as the horses moved. Her boots kicked up dust that got into her throat, making her cough until her ribs hurt. The stars above, like cold ash, and she wondered if anyone else was out there, awake, noticing her absence. By the time they stopped again, she could barely lift her feet. They left her against a post, rope looped around it, while they set up a small fire. She could smell the beans they cooked, hear the metal spoon scraping against the tin. They didn't offer her any. That was when she heard it. The slow, uneven tread of boots approaching from somewhere beyond the firelight. Heavy, deliberate steps. The two men turned, hands instinctively brushing their belts. But the figure that emerged from the darkness wasn't like them. Broad shoulders, weather-worn coat, and a face half hidden by the shadow of a hat. His voice was low, rough from disuse when he spoke. "Evenin'." They didn't answer right away, just eyed him with the suspicion that came when strangers wandered into the wrong kind of company. He nodded toward her. "She yours?" One of the men smirked. "Why? You want her?" The stranger didn't flinch. He took a few more steps forward, and in the flicker of firelight, she caught a glimpse of his eyes. Steady, unreadable, but not cruel. "No," he said. "Just seems you're not treating her right." There was a pause then, like the air itself had stopped moving. The man with the cigarette spat into the dirt. "Ain't your business." The stranger didn't answer. He just looked at her a second longer, like he was measuring something, then stepped into the firelight. And that's when she saw it. His hands, large and calloused, but gentle in the way they reached toward her rope. The fire crackled low, its amber light flickering across the cabin's rough-hewn walls. By now, the storm outside had grown worse, snow sweeping across the prairie in blinding sheets. The wind clawed at the shutters like a wild animal, howling through the gaps in the wood. Marla sat curled up on the cot, her mended arm bound neatly in strips of clean linen. The pain had dulled, though the memory of the cruel laughter that had haunted her just days before still lingered. She kept glancing toward the door, as if she feared at any moment it might burst open, and the men who had hurt her would come to finish what they started. Across from her, the cowboy sat with his hat tipped low, sharpening a blade in slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of steel against stone was steady, unhurried. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. "You keep looking at that door," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "Ain't no one getting through it without me knowing. You're safe here." She tried to believe him. She wanted to, but safety was something she hadn't felt in a very long time. "They'll come back," she murmured. "They always do." He set the knife down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Not this time. Something in his tone was different. Not bravado, not empty comfort. It was the voice of a man who had seen enough of cruelty to recognize when it needed to be ended. The kettle hissed softly on the stove, and he poured her a mug of tea, sliding it across the small table. The scent of pine and honey rose in the air, cutting through the cabin's cold draft. "You're shaking," he said. "I'm cold," she lied. "No," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "You're remembering." She swallowed hard. Her hands trembled as she gripped the mug. "They laughed, while they were breaking me. Like it was some game, like I was—" Her voice caught. "Nothing." The cowboy didn't interrupt. He let her speak, his silence solid as the logs stacked in the hearth. "They said no one would help me," she went on. "That no one cared. They were wrong," he said simply. The words landed heavier than she expected. She set the mug down before she spilled it. He rose from the chair and stepped toward the door. For a moment, she thought he was leaving, and a flicker of panic shot through her. But instead, he pulled back the curtain over the small window. Outside, the snow swirled so thick it looked like the world itself was dissolving. "They'll be snowed in until morning," he said. "That gives us time." "Time for what?" she asked. His gaze stayed on the storm, as if measuring the night. "To make sure they can't hurt you again." Her pulse quickened. "You're going after them?" He didn't answer right away. "When I was a boy, my father told me there are two kinds of men, those who break and those who mend. You don't get to be both. You make your choice and you live with it." "And you?" she asked. His eyes met hers, dark and unwavering. "I mend, but sometimes—" His hand brushed the handle of his revolver resting on the table. "You have to break what's already rotten." Marla looked away, unsure if she wanted him to go or to stay. The thought of him confronting those men stirred a strange mix of fear and hope inside her. "You could be killed," she whispered. He smiled faintly, as if the thought hadn't occurred to him or mattered little. "I've been killed a dozen times already, just never stuck." She didn't understand what he meant, but something in his voice told her he wasn't talking about bullets or blood. The wind rattled the shutters again, and she flinched. Without a word, he crossed the room and placed a heavy blanket around her shoulders, tucking it in so it wouldn't slip. "You need rest," he said. "And you?" "I'll keep watch." Marla lay back on the cot, though her mind refused to quiet. She watched him by the firelight, tall, still, eyes scanning the room as though every shadow might hold an intruder. The flames threw his silhouette onto the wall, larger than life, like a sentinel carved in gold and black. Somewhere in the night, she drifted into a shallow sleep, haunted by fractured dreams of boots on snow, hands gripping her arms, the sharp crack of bone. But always, before the dream could spiral into darkness, another image appeared, the cowboy's face, steady and calm, a quiet defiance in his eyes. When she woke, the storm had eased. A pale gray light seeped through the window. The fire was low but still burning. The cowboy was gone. Panic surged through her. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, her mended arm throbbing. The door creaked open before she could stand. He stepped inside, snow dusting his coat, the brim of his hat heavy with frost. In his hand, he carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "They won't trouble you again," he said. His voice was quiet, but there was a finality to it. A door closed. A chapter ended. She didn't ask what he'd done. She didn't need to. Instead, she took the bundle he offered. Inside was a loaf of bread, still warm, and a handful of berries glistening like drops of wine. "Eat," he said. She hesitated. "Why are you doing this?" He shrugged, as if the answer was obvious. "Because no one did it for me, once." And then, without another word, he removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It smelled faintly of pine and smoke. For the first time in a long time, Marla felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. The thaw came late that year. Even as March gave way to April, the snow lingered in stubborn drifts, casting long shadows over the ranch. By then, Eliza could manage more than just walking. She could ride again, though not without the ache that would forever remind her of what had been done. Each movement carried a memory, but each day also carried the proof that she'd survived. The cowboy, Miles, had never asked her to explain every detail. He'd pieced together enough from her restless nights, from the way she'd startle at the sound of boots on the porch, or how her eyes would harden when the wind rattled the shutters like a fist on a door. He didn't need the whole story to understand the weight of it. But one morning, as they rode the fence line under a sky stretched thin with pale clouds, she spoke, not in a rush, but in fragments, the words halting and uneven. She told him about the men who had laughed as they bent her arms past their breaking point, about how they had left her in the snow, convinced she wouldn't last the night, about the hours she lay there, watching the stars wheel overhead, feeling her life draining away with each shallow breath. Miles didn't interrupt. He kept his eyes on the horizon, hands loose on the reins, letting her voice fill the air between them. When she was done, when there was nothing left to say, he simply said, "They won't touch you again." The quiet certainty in his tone was worth more than any promise she'd heard before. The weeks ahead were a slow rebuilding. The townsfolk, who had once turned their faces away, now nodded to her in the street. Some offered awkward apologies. Others brought bread or firewood, as if they could erase their earlier neglect. Eliza accepted what she could, but she knew trust wasn't something you rebuilt with warm loaves and polite words. What she did cling to was the strange, steady bond between her and Miles. He was still a solitary figure, not one for lingering in town or sharing much about his own past, but she learned to read his silences, the way his jaw tightened when someone mentioned the border wars, or the way he'd sit outside at night, hat brim low, staring into the dark like he was expecting someone. She never asked. Some wounds weren't meant for daylight. By summer, the snow was gone, but the scars, hers and his, remained. They didn't pretend otherwise. Life didn't return to what it had been. It couldn't, but it did move forward. The ranch became more than just a refuge. It became a place where both of them could keep the past at arm's length without letting it rule them. And though neither said the words outright, there was an unspoken truth that hung between them like the scent of wood smoke on a cold morning. Survival wasn't just about living through the night. Sometimes it was about finding the one person who'd sit beside you in the dark and make sure the fire never went out.